This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. To pre-order Tarkir Dragonstorm, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Sab-Sunen. Earlier today, the full card gallery for Tarkir Dragonstorm dropped, and that means it's time to start my limited set review for the format. Over the next several days, I'll be evaluating every single card in the set to get you ready for your pre-release or the release of the set on Magic Arena. We're starting today with the multicolored and colorless cards. Multicolored is always a nice place to start because multicolored cards do a good job of introducing us to the set's archetypes and mechanics, and they also tend to be some of the most powerful cards in a set, and that's especially true for a set like Tarkir Dragonstorm, which has way more multicolored cards than normal because of its focus on 5 3-colored clans. For each of these multicolored and colorless cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description. There are some important things to keep in mind. We're only talking about Draft and Sealed here. First, we're only talking about Draft and Sealed. That means I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. Second, these are, of course, my evaluations of these cards before it's possible to play the new format, since the goal is to have my set review done for you in time for the pre-release, and that means I'll be wrong about some things, but as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have panned out. Lastly, I want to remind you that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once this set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the multicolored and colorless cards in Tarkir Dragonstorm. First up, it's All Out Assault, which for 2 generic, a red, a white, and a black is a mythic rare enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and have death touch. When this enchantment enters, if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase, followed by an additional main phase. When you next attack this turn, untap each creature you control. So the buff in Death Touch is pretty nice, as it makes any creature you have in play a real pain, both as an attacker and a blocker, and it's nice when a card like this is also good on defense. The extra combat phase is okay. Having bigger Death Touch creatures is likely to help you take advantage of that phase a little more than this type of effect usually allows for. After all, creatures are hitting harder and kill anything that blocked them. Usually that kind of effect isn't that great, since you already need good attacks for it to be worth it, but I think this buff does enough to move the needle in that direction. All that said, it still asks you to have a significant board state or it's pretty mediocre. And there will be plenty of times where you still can't really take advantage of the extra combat phase. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Armament Dragon, which for 3 generic, a white, a black, and a green is a 3/4 dragon at uncommon. It has flying, and when it enters, you distribute 3 +1/+1 counters among 1, 2, or 3 target creatures you control. So at worst, this can put all 3 counters on itself, giving you a 6 mana, 6/7 flyer, which is certainly a threat, and oftentimes you'll be able to put the counters on creatures that can attack right away. That's often the better option because you don't put all of your eggs in one basket, and because it kind of gives those 3 counters haste, because it's going to augment creatures that can attack right away. This looks like a 6-drop that virtually always reshapes the board in a significant way when it comes down, and I like that a lot. I'm giving it a B. You can also add to all of that the fact that Abzan is super into +1/+1 counters, making it even better. Next up, it's Auroral Procession, which for a green and a blue is an uncommon instant. It says return target card from your graveyard to your hand. So an instant speed Simic regrowth doesn't seem that great in Limited. Sure, getting any card back is nice and flexible, but you're also just spinning your wheels. There are a couple of things going on in this format that make this card a little better than it looks at first. One of them is the Flurry mechanic. That's a mechanic that pays you off for double spelling, and theoretically, if you cast this and get a spell back and cast that, you can trigger Flurry. Additionally, there are cards that pay you off for having cards leave your graveyard, and this helps trigger those. But this still mostly looks like a support card for getting back your best cards, and it'll get a little bit better when you have bombs and stuff, but it's kind of like you end up spending 2 extra mana on whatever card is in your graveyard, and that tax does make it hard to feel great about whatever this card does. I think it's just a C-. Next up, it's Awaken the Honored Dead, which for a black, a green, and a blue is a rare enchantment saga. Its Chapter 1 says destroy target non-land permanent, Chapter 2 says mill 3 cards, and Chapter 3 says you may discard a card. When you do, return target creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. So most of the value here comes up front with Chapter 1, which can efficiently deal with a non-land, so it's pretty great that you get some very real additional value out of this on subsequent turns, and oftentimes the best sagas are the ones that impact the board the turn they come down, and the ones that take a while to actually do something to the board are less good, but luckily this is one of the former sagas that does impact the board right away. Chapter 2 on its own isn't amazing, but Sultai is into the graveyard, and then Chapter 3 can help you take advantage of the graveyard because you can choose to get rid of a card in your hand to return a creature or land from your graveyard to your hand. That effect isn't insane or anything, it's sort of like the blue-green card we just saw. You give up a card in hand to get something back from your graveyard, but you're getting that on top of the fact that you got to destroy your opponent's best non-land and load your graveyard for your other cards too, so you end up getting a lot of value out of this card, as is the case for the best sagas. You pay very little mana and get a lot, even if you have to wait to get all of the effects. I think this is a B+. Next up, it's Barren Steppe Siege, which for 2 generic, a white and a black, is a rare enchantment. As it enters, you choose Abzan or Mardu. If you choose Abzan, at the beginning of your end step, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. And if you chose Mardu, at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died under your control this turn, each opponent sacrifices a creature of their choice. It's great that both of these are end step triggers, so you do get something the turn it comes down. It's always a problem when you have an enchantment that doesn't do anything the turn it comes down, but this one does, and the modality is nice too. I do think most of the time you're just going to go with Abzan. Putting counters on all of your creatures is a pretty big deal and can quickly snowball and make your board really scary. But the Mardu mode can be pretty good, especially if your opponent happens to only have one creature in play and you had something die. This just turns into a removal spell that will then generate more value later, and basically their board will become empty. It also works really well with Mobilize, a mechanic that gives you temporary 1/1 tokens that get sacrificed at the end of your turn when you attack. So Mobilize will let you trigger this like every single turn. So there are times where you're going to choose Mardu, especially if you're heavy in Mobilize and you really need to remove your opponent's creatures more than you need to buff your own. And I do like that they're good in kind of different situations like that. That always makes a modal card better. And overall, this just looks really strong. I mean, choosing Abzan is going to win you a lot of games, and it's going to be what you do, I don't know, like 80% of the time. But the times when you do choose Mardu and it's really good, it's also just probably going to win you the game. And because you get at least one trigger the turn it comes down, you're really never going to feel like you're not getting something good out of this, even if your opponent can destroy it right away, and usually they won't be able to. I think it's a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's Baitor, Kin to All, which for 2 generic, a white, a black, and a green is a 5/7 Spirit Dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and at the beginning of your end step, if creatures you control have total toughness 10 or greater, draw a card. Then if creatures you control have total toughness 20 or greater, untap each creature you control. Then if creatures you control have total toughness 40 or greater, each opponent loses half their life rounded up. So because this adds 7 toughness to the board on its own and counts it in its toughness totaling triggers, drawing a card the turn you play it is super doable. You just need to have 3 other toughness on the battlefield, in which case this is a 5 mana 5/7 with flying that draws you a card that has the potential to draw you more cards on future turns, and I just think that's how this is going to play out most of the time. It is kind of funny that in Limited, I actually think the toughness 10 or greater effect is actually just the strongest. Untapping your creatures isn't that meaningful, and while your opponent losing half of their life can be meaningful, it does have diminishing returns the longer the game goes on. So while you might get those other 2 effects, you're usually not going to, but you're also perfectly fine with just having a huge dragon that draws you a card every single turn, and yeah, it's a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Bone Cairn Butcher, which for 1 generic, a red, a white, and a black is a 4/4 demon at uncommon. It has Mobilize 2. I've mentioned this mechanic a couple of times. That means when it attacks, you create 2 tapped and attacking 1/1 red warrior creature tokens, and you sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. And Bone Cairn Butcher gives attacking tokens you control Death Touch. So Mobilize is a pretty sweet mechanic. They have put a bunch of ways in the set to take advantage of these tokens, even though they're only temporary, and Bone Cairn Butcher is a card that can make these tokens and take advantage of them. Because normally, if your opponent just has creatures who are big enough to block these little Mobilize tokens, they're just going to block them to avoid taking the damage. But if Bone Cairn Butcher's in play, they can't really do that. And obviously it works with its own ability, but it gets even better if you have other Mobilize things in play the turn you play this, because suddenly attacking with your Mobilize creatures is way, way better. It It also works on other tokens, and there are other tokens in the format. The Endure mechanic makes tokens, for example, and giving any attacking token Death Touch is great, but Mobilize is the way you can most take advantage of this. And then on top of all of that, it has a solid stat line itself. It gives you solid value all on its own, in addition to making every card with Mobilize, which is the Mardu mechanic, better in your entire deck. I think it's a B. Next up, it's called the Spirit Dragons, which for a white, a blue, a black, a red, and a green is a mythic rare enchantment. Dragons you control have indestructible. At the beginning of your upkeep, for each color, put a +1/+1 counter on a dragon you control of that color. If you put a +1/+1 counter on 5 dragons this way, you win the game. Yeah, this isn't here for limited. I mean, mana is really good in this format, and there are lots of dragons, but this is still going to be very hard to cast, and you have to hope that when you do, you have at least one dragon around. That's certainly doable, but if you're spending 5 on an enchantment that gives you 1 counter every turn and maybe makes 1 creature indestructible, you're not going to feel great about the situation. And even in this format, actually winning the game or getting more than 1 counter out of this is going to be a challenge. I think this is probably just an F. It's kind of a trap. It's going to make you have really bad mana and then not have enough of a big payoff when you're playing limited, just because your deck won't be consistent enough to take advantage of it. Next up, it's Quarry Mountain Stalwart, which for 1 generic, a red and a white, is a 3/3 human monk at uncommon, and it has Flurry, which means something good happens when you cast your second spell each turn. In this case, it deals 2 damage to each opponent, and you gain 2 life. Hitting your opponent with a mini lightning helix every time you double spell is pretty sweet. I do think Flurry is not something you're going to be triggering every single turn. I think when you evaluate and look at cards with Flurry, you should probably expect to trigger them like once, maybe twice. And if you're looking at a card like that and just triggering it once isn't that meaningful, it's probably not great. The good news for Quarry Mountain Stalwart is just triggering this once is pretty good, and if you can do it more than that, things are going to get really interesting. And on top of that, it has a pretty solid stat line. I think it's a C+. Next, it's Death Begets Life, which for 5 generic, a black, a green, and a blue, is a mythic rare sorcery. Destroy all creatures and enchantments, draw a card for each permanent destroyed this way. This is pretty cool. They kind of gave us a Sultai Overwhelming Forces, although it's symmetrical. So if you get to 8 mana, this is going to win you the game a lot of the time, because you get to blow everything up and draw a whole bunch of cards to make up for anything that you lost, plus taking advantage of anything your opponent lost. This means you're going to outcard your opponent in a big way. They usually will still get to rebuild their board before you do, since you just spent 8 mana, and that's a bit of a bummer. But you have so much card advantage that you should be able to overtake them. Now the bad news is, by the time you get to 8 mana in many games, there is a very real risk that you just mill yourself out when you cast this, especially because Sultai decks are into milling themselves. And so, like, if you destroy 10 permanents with this, which is not a crazy outcome at 8 mana, there's a chance you just lost because you cast Death Begets Life. So it's a really awkward card because it's in a 3-color combination that's very into the graveyard, which means you're going to be milling yourself, and it draws you a whole bunch of cards, which when you only have a 40-card deck is pretty dangerous. I mean, I do think there are games that this is going to win, but there are going to be lots of games where you lose too. It's just a very swingy card. I think I'm going to start it at a C, and it is honestly the kind of card that could just end up being an F. Next up, it's Defibrillating Current. It has a hybrid mana cost, but one that involves colorless, so you can either pay 2 colorless or a red, 2 colorless or a white, 2 colorless or a black for it, which means you can spend mana in a lot of different ways on it. The most common way in limited is either going to be that you just spend a red, a white, and a black for it, or you spend 2 generic because you're missing one of the colors, and then pay the other 2 colored mana. So either you end up spending 4 total mana or 3 total mana, but you can potentially cast it for like 6 generic. Defibrillating Current is an uncommon sorcery, and it does 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain 2 life. When we look at these cards, you have to think about how good it is when you spend 4 mana on it versus how good it is when you spend 3 on it, because like I said, those are the 2 most common outcomes. And the good news is, even if you pay 4 for this, you're going to feel all right about things because you get to kill something and gain a little bit of life. Being a sorcery is a bit of a letdown, but 3 or 4 mana to do 4 and gain 2, I mean, that's just a card you would play, though it isn't like insane either. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Disruptive Stormbrood, which for 4 generic and a green is an uncommon dragon with flying. It's a 3/3, and when it enters, you destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment. but it also has a new mechanic that debuted in this set called Omen. It's kind of like Adventure, where one side of the card is a spell. In this case, it's Petty Revenge for 1 generic and a black. It's a sorcery, and it destroys target creature with power 3 or less. And the difference between an Omen and an Adventure is that an Omen gets shuffled back into your library when you cast it, rather than getting exiled the way a card with Adventure does, where you can just recast the other side later in the game. So these spells are a lot more modal than Adventures are, because with Adventures, you can usually find a way to get both sides every time you cast the spell side. That's not always going to be true here. This looks like a pretty good card overall. The removal mode on this is what's going to be the best, the most frequently. You're going to be able to trade up with that effect a decent chunk of the time. I mean, for example, it can kill Disruptive Stormbrood, and you're never really going to feel bad about casting Petty Revenge. It's just very hard for it not to at least deliver decent value. And then Disruptive Stormbrood is like an okay dragon that will occasionally naturalize something. They're going to be a huge chunk of the time where it's just a 5-mana 3/3 flyer, but we're still talking about something modal here, and like the removal side is like a C+ level removal spell. The creature side is probably like a D+ or a C-, but I think the modality here is pretty legit. I mean, when you can play the Stormbrood and it has a target, it feels great. And when you can't, you'll just cast it as Petty Revenge, and then maybe you redraw this removal spell later in the game, or maybe you redraw the Stormbrood when it actually has a target. Either way, you're going to be pretty happy with the outcome with this card. I think that's enough for it to be a B-. Next up, it's Dragonback Assault, which for 3 generic, a green, a blue, and a red is a mythic rare enchantment. When it enters, it deals 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, and it has landfall. Create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. This is really strong. It can come down and wipe away everything small, and then start spitting out 4/4s. Basically, it's a sweeper and a win condition all in one. The interest trigger isn't always something you can make sure hurts your opponent more than it hurts you, but you can get away with it being sort of equal, or even you being a little bit behind, since you're the one who's going to generate 4/4 flyers by playing lands. Even getting one of those looks really good, and it can do far better than that. I do think you're usually going to want to wait to play this until turn 7, especially if you're in a situation where your opponent is holding on to a decent number of creatures, because that way you can then drop a land and get that 4/4 dragon right away in the wake of, decimating the board with the enters trigger. But in situations where it really hurts your opponent way more than it hurts you, you're just going to run it out on 6 and count on getting dragons later. Overall, I think this looks like a bomb. I mean, imagine if this was always 7 mana for a 4/4 dragon with flying that does 3 damage to each other creature and each other planeswalker when it enters. That would be an amazing card, and that's kind of what this is, but it has even more upside because it can give you more dragons. So yeah, this looks like a great card. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Dragonclaw Strike. This is another one of the hybrid mana cards, so you can pay a green, a blue, and a red, or for any of those, you can pay 2 generic instead. And it's an uncommon sorcery. It says double the power and toughness of target creature you control until end of turn, then it fights up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. This looks great to me. Even if it was going to make me pay 3 for the effect without the stats boost, it would be like a C. But with the stats boost, well, this lets you kill almost anything, and there will be a significant chunk of the time where it also lets you smash in for a huge hit, or at the very least force an ugly block. I'm definitely down with paying 4 for that, and very excited to pay 3. I think it's a B. Next up, it's Effortless Master, which for 2 generic, a blue and a red, is a 4/3 Orc Monk at uncommon. It's got Vigilance and Menace, and when it enters, it does so with 2+1/+1 counters if you've cast 2 or more spells this turn. So if you can cast 1 spell before this, it's going to feel great. I mean, a 4-mana 6/5 with Vigilance and Menace is going to dominate just about any board, and if you're in one of the Jeskai color pairs, you're going to be reasonably able to set this thing up with 1 and 2 mana spells, and the baseline of a 4-mana 4/3 with Vigilance and Menace is like a C. I think you'll be able to achieve the ceiling often enough for this to be a C+, though obviously when you do achieve that ceiling, it'll feel more like a B+, but we do have to account for all situations. Next up, it's Eshki Dragonclaw, which for 1 generic, a green, a blue, and a red is a 4/4 legendary human warrior at rare. It's got Vigilance, Trample, and Ward 1, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've cast both a creature spell and a non-creature spell this turn, draw a card and put 2+1/+1 counters on Eshki Dragonclaw. This trigger is really great, but even in Temur, it's not going to be super easy to both cast a creature and a non-creature in a turn. It's doable, don't get me wrong, and you do only need to trigger it once for you to be really happy, but don't count on doing it with regularity either. Triggering it once is probably the ceiling in most games, although the extra card draw might help you pull it off. Again, it also starts with nice stats to begin with, and I think the whole package means this is a B+. Next up, it's Fangkeeper's Familiar, which for one generic, a black, a green, and a blue is a 3/3 rare snake with flash. When it enters, you choose one. You can gain 3 life and surveil 3, or you can destroy target enchantment, or you can counter target creature spell. I'm a huge fan of Mystic Snake and similar cards, and this is the best Mystic Snake ever in a lot of ways. Sure, it can't counter any type of spell, but the fact it has 2 other modes makes up for that in a big way. If you leave up mana for this, you'll fire it off to counter a spell if you can, or destroy an enchantment, but the fail case here is that you gain 3 and surveil 3, which is pretty good. Sometimes you might also ambush something, so 2-for-1s are very doable, and a 3-for-1 isn't entirely off the table, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Felithar, Dawn of the Abzan, which for a white, a black, and a green is a 3/3 legendary human warrior at rare. It's got trample, and whenever it enters or attacks, you can sacrifice a non-land permanent. When you do, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Giving up an expendable permanent, like a token or a monument, which we'll see later in this video, and buffing your whole board is a pretty powerful effect, and it's great that you can do it when Felithar enters or attacks. That means the board can get a big buff immediately, and then threaten to get even bigger on the next turn. Now, you won't always have a super built out board or expendable non-lands, especially on turn 3 or 4 when you run this out, but in those situations, it's a creature with decent stats that can threaten to do all kinds of nonsense later. Also, the Endure mechanic helps you make tokens. This looks like a really good card overall. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Flamehold Grappler, which for a blue, a red, and a white is a 3/3 human monk at rare. It's got first strike, and when it enters, you copy the next spell you cast this turn when you cast it, and you can choose new targets for the copy. It's not always easy to have a spell to cast after you spend 3 mana on this thing, but obviously Jeskai is especially into finding ways to double spell, so having some cheap spells to play after this isn't super far-fetched. It also works kind of interestingly with Harmonize, which is actually the Teamer mechanic, because it's possible playing the Grappler lets you tap it to cast a Harmonize spell from the graveyard, and you'll get that spell twice. It also has the kind of first strike body that's relevant on most boards, giving it a B. Next up, it's Frontline Rush, which for a red and a white is an uncommon instant. Choose one, create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, or target creature gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. Both of these modes are pretty awesome for the cost. The combat trick is going to end some games out of nowhere and help lots of creatures win combat and punch above their weight class. And when you can't really use the trick, you have a spell that will help you go wide, which is exactly what you want to be doing in red-white. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Frostcliff Siege, which for one generic, a blue and a red is a rare enchantment. When it enters, you can choose Jeskai or Teamer. If you choose Jeskai, whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card. And if you use Teamer, creatures you control get +1/+0 and have trample and haste. I don't love that both of these buffs are really only good when you're already ahead and have a decent board presence. I mean, it's true that this is going to upgrade your board one way or another, but I'd be happier with this if it had 2 effects that are good in different situations instead of 2 that are good in pretty much the same situation. So if you're behind, this won't do a ton, but it'll certainly be good if you're at parity or ahead, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Glacial Dragon Hunt, which for a blue and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It says draw a card, then you may discard a card. When you discard an online card this way, it deals 3 damage to target creature, and it does Harmonize, which I mentioned a moment ago. For 4 generic, a blue and a red, you can cast it from your graveyard, and when you do, you can tap a creature you control to reduce the cost by X, where X is its power, and then you exile this spell. So paying 2 mana to loot and do 3 to something is pretty nice. And while discarding a non-land doesn't sound amazing, look at it as letting you turn that card into a removal spell, and it doesn't seem so bad, especially if you're discarding something with Harmonize, which the Dragon Hunt also has. That means you get 2 removal spells here ultimately, and while it's conditional and a little clunky, it seems pretty good to me overall. Sometimes you can also choose not to discard a card at all, and obviously it's sort of like think twice when you do that, although worse in most ways. But there will be times where you just want to hold on to the card you drew and don't really have a non-land you want to discard, so it's nice that it's optional. Overall, I think that makes this a C+. Next up, it's Glacierwood Siege, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue is a rare enchantment. When it enters, you choose Teamer or Sultai. If you choose Teamer, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, target player mills 4 cards, and if you choose Sultai, you can play lands from your graveyard. This siege is not very good. The others are all pretty nice, but neither of these are very good effects in limited. The Sultai part just doesn't matter very much, even if you're good at loading your graveyard, and the Teamer side has the potential to mill your opponent out, but it's narrow enough that I'm not really feeling that either. You have to cast instants or sorceries specifically. This looks like a pretty big dud to me, giving it a D. It also, of course, doesn't add to the board at all in any way, unlike the other sieges we've seen so far, and that's a pretty big problem. Next up, it's Gurmag Nightwatch, which is another one of these hybrid mana cards. So you can pay a black, a green, and a blue, or pay 2 generic for any of those. It's a 3/3 Human Ranger. When it enters, you look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may put one of those cards back on top of your library, put the rest into your graveyard. This is an okay way to add to the board while improving your next draw and loading up your graveyard for Sultai shenanigans. I do think you need to be spending 3 on this one for it to feel worth playing though, because once we're talking about a hill giant with this ability, it's going to feel way, way worse. It just doesn't give you enough value to make up for being a 4 mana 3/3 when you're in that situation, and I think that holds us to a C. Next up, it's Hardened Tactician, which for 1 generic, a white and a black, is a 2/4 human warrior at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and sacrifice a token to draw a card. This is a pretty incredible payoff for mobilizing. Only having to pay a single generic to turn one of those temporary 1/1s into actual cards is pretty amazing, and I don't think you'll have to work very hard to take advantage of that on a regular basis in Black, White, or Mardu more broadly. This has insane value engine potential and solid stats to start with, giving it a B. Next up, it's Hollowmurk Siege, which for a black and a green is a rare enchantment. When it enters, you choose Sultai or Abzan. If you choose Sultai, whenever a counter is put on a creature you control, you draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. And if you choose Abzan, whenever you attack, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains Menace until end of turn. Well, this is really good, especially when you're only spending 2 freaking mana. The Abzan mode is the one you'll probably choose the most here, since it doesn't ask for much of you, just that you have something that can attack. And since you can give a counter and menace to whatever does the attacking, you've probably got a good attack ready to go. Obviously, drawing cards is good too, and that's a mode you might go with when you have tons of ways to put counters on things in your hand, but that Abzan mode is going to pressure your opponent in a big way and snowball in a hurry. Honestly, I think this is a bomb. It's just so cheap and delivers insane value with both modes, giving it an A. Next up, it's Host of the Hereafter, which for 2 generic, a black, and a green is a 2/2 zombie warlock at uncommon. It enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and whenever this creature, or another creature you control, dies, if it had counters on it, put its counters on up to 1 target creature you control. So this is a 4 mana 4/4 that gives its 2 counters to something else when it dies. And obviously it helps out all of your other cards that have counters on them. Keep in mind, it doesn't only work with +1/+1 counters, there are a few cards in the set that use keyword counters, so sometimes you'll be able to get even more than just +1/+1 counters out of it. So this looks like a nice 4-drop for those decks, and it can make your attacks on turn 4 much better than they were before if you have creatures with counters in play, and the baseline here is fine, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Inevitable Defeat, which for 1 generic, a red, a white, and a black is a rare instant. Can't be countered, exile target non-land permanent, its controller loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. 4 mana to exile a non-land isn't like an insane deal, but it is flexible, and you'll trade up sometimes. But when you get to drain 3 life on top of that, it's pretty amazing. It helps make up for the fact that it may take a while for you to get the mana to cast this. This looks like a great removal spell. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Jeskai Brushmaster, which for 1 generic, a blue, a red, and a white is a 2/4 Orc Monk at uncommon. It's got double strike and prowess. So a 4 mana 2/4 with only double strike would be a pretty solid card, but once you throw prowess in the mix, things get extra silly, since your opponent will have no idea just how big it's going to be. That makes blocking it, or not blocking it, potentially really painful, and making your opponent pick their poison like that is amazing. It gets especially nuts with combat tricks, and the Brushmaster is even pretty good on defense the turn it comes down. I think it's a B. Next up, it's Jeskai Revelation, which for 4 generic, a blue, a red, and a white is a mythic rare instant. Return target spell or permanent to its owner's hand. Jeskai Revelation deals 4 damage to any target. Create 2 1/1 white monk creature tokens with prowess. Draw 2 cards, you gain 4 life. This is expensive, but boy does it deliver. I mean, bouncing a permanent or a spell, killing a creature, getting 2 1/1s with upside, drawing 2, and gaining 4 is nuts. It's a 3-for-1 at a minimum, and sometimes it's even more insane than that. This turns the game around virtually any time you cast it. The only hurdle is the mana, but 7 is generally somewhere you can get to in most limited formats. You know, it's usually like the top end, so I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Jeskai Shrine Keeper, which for 2 generic, a blue, a red, and a white is a 3/3 dragon at uncommon with flying and haste, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you gain a life and draw a card. So this can come down and smash in for 3 while drawing you a card and gaining you a life, and that's going to feel great. The bad news is, reach and flying is all over the place in this set, and there's a reasonable chance your opponent has a creature that can block this that is cheaper than it is, since the stat line itself is pretty mediocre. Sometimes this can take over the game. If your opponent just can't block it, it's going to win the game for you. But it will also frequently be destroyed for like 2 mana or be blocked by something that costs way less mana, and that's the kind of thing that can really swing a game in the other way. So I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Kara-Kick Guardian, which for 3 generic, a green, a blue, and a red is a 6/5 dragon at uncommon. It's got flying, vigilance, and trample, and has hexproof if it hasn't dealt damage yet. This is a nice threat, and the hexproof clause is nice upside to have on top of the other 3 really good keywords. Your opponent either has to take 6 from it or lose a creature one way or another before they can target it with removal, and if you do either of those things before they remove it, you don't feel terrible about it dying. Just don't do something silly like block a mobilized token with it, because that'll mean they give up nothing and can use their removal on it. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Keru Goldkeeper, which for 1 generic, a black, a green, and a blue is a 3/3 dragon at uncommon. It's got flying. Whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard during your turn, create a treasure token, and it has Renew. This is the first time we're seeing this mechanic in this set. That means you pay a cost and you exile this from the graveyard to give a creature in play something. In this case, you pay 2 generic, a black, a green, and a blue, exile it, and put 2 +1/+1 counters and a flying counter on target creature, activate only as a sorcery. So a 4 mana 3/3 flyer, especially one that's a little challenging to cast, isn't what it used to be. That used to be an amazing stat line. These days, if this were just a vanilla 4 mana 3/3 flyer that was this hard to cast, it would be like a D+ or a C-. It's just too inefficient for today's game. But this does a lot more than that. For one thing, it can generate some treasure. If you use Renew or Harmonize, those are mechanics that exile things from your graveyard. If you use a card that returns a card from your graveyard to your hand, it's going to trigger this. So getting treasure with it is pretty doable. But I think it's the Renew ability that gives this a big bump. 2 +1/+1 counters and a flying counter going on one of your creatures makes almost anything into a threat. You do have to be careful. You know, if your opponent has mana up when you do that, you're going to take a massive tempo hit. But it's not hard to find a time to use this and really augment a creature into a very real threat. And it's going to feel pretty close to a 2-for-1 when you can get this body in play, trade it off for something, and then use this ability from the graveyard. The baseline is still kind of rough, but I think it does enough other stuff to be a pretty good card. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Kin Tree Severance, another one of these hybrid cards, so you can pay white, black, green for it, but you can also pay 2 generic for any of those. And it's an uncommon instant, exile target permanent with mana value 3 or greater. I think you need to pay 3 for this for it to feel great. But paying 4 is not a disaster either. This will often be able to trade up even when you're spending 4, and in a format where it looks like big creatures will dominate the late game, that might be even more true than usual. Giving it a B-. Next up, it's Kishla Skimmer, which for a green and a blue is a 2/2 Bird Scout and uncommon. It's got flying, and whenever a card leaves your graveyard during your turn, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this is a strong payoff for harmonizing or renewing or returning a card from your graveyard, and it can certainly get in for a few hits in the early game too. This makes it seem like it will be pretty nice on turn 2, and then when you play it in the late game, when you start to use all of your renew and harmonize abilities from the graveyard, it's going to turn into a value engine. Looks pretty good to me overall, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Kotis, the Fang Keeper, which for 1 generic, a black, a green, and a blue is a 2/1 legendary zombie warrior at rare with indestructible. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, exile the top X cards of their library, where X is the amount of damage dealt. You may cast any number of spells with mana value X or less from among them without paying their mana costs. Being indestructible is nice, but being this small isn't. It's not going to get in for combat damage on your opponent all that often all on its own, since you aren't playing this until turn 4 in most cases, and your opponent can just block it with like a 3/3 and not care about it at that point. However, there are some interesting things going on here that make us better. The biggest thing is Renew. It generally buffs your creatures and makes them into better creatures, and it's, you know, the Simic mechanic, and Kotis is a Simic card, so the idea of buffing this in various ways really isn't far-fetched. You're going to be able to do it, And once that's true, you get to start casting spells off the top of your opponent's library and stuff like that. It certainly takes some work, like the baseline card, if you have no ways to augment Kotus is probably like a C, a card that you sort of hope that you can get in at some point, but you probably can't, so it sort of turns into like a bad wall that your opponent probably can't deal with. But it has a way higher ceiling than that, and I think your typical Sultai deck will be able to buff it enough for it to be a B-. Next up, it's Lie in Wait, which for a black, a green, and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Lie in Wait deals damage equal to that card's power to target creature. So you need a card in your graveyard, but even if you just get back like a 2/2 and kill their 2/2 for 3 mana, you're going to feel really happy about what just happened. And in Sultai, you're likely to have a well-stocked enough graveyard to get back something more substantial that can kill more of your opponent's creatures. It is maybe a little bit of a non-bow that you have this mechanic that has you exile your creatures from your graveyard, but I still think most of the time you'll be able to get something back and kill something with this, and it's going to feel like a very strong 2-for-1, I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Lotus Light Dancers, which for 2 generic, a black, a green, and a blue is a 3/6 zombie bard at rare. It's got lifelink. When it enters, you search your library for a black card, a green card, and a blue card, and put those cards into your graveyard, then shuffle. So the idea here is to search up cards with Harmonize or Renew, for the most part, but you might also have some other graveyard nonsense too, but those are the most likely things you're going to tutor up. And putting those into your graveyard, while probably not quite worth a full card most of the time, is certainly worth something, especially when you're getting a really tough lifelink body that's going to be a very real roadblock for your opponent. Obviously, it's not a terrible thing to renew onto by giving it keywords and counters, and it can set that up all on its own. This looks pretty good to me, giving it a B. Next up, it's Mammoth Bellow, which for 2 generic, a green, a blue, and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It creates a 5/5 green elephant creature token, and it has Harmonize for 5 generic, a green, a blue, and a red. This Harmonize card delivers a legit 2-for-1 since it gives you 2 awesome, very relevant bodies, and you can even use the first one to help you harmonize into the second one, giving it a B. Next up, it's Mardu Siegebreaker, which for 1 generic, a red, a white, and a black is a 4/4 human warrior at rare. It's got Death Touch and Haste. When it enters, you exile up to 1 other target creature you control until this creature leaves the battlefield. And when this creature attacks, for each opponent, create a tap token that's a copy of the exiled card attacking that opponent. So you're not always going to have something you want to exile here. The token enters tapped and only sticks around for a turn. You need to be rebuying an enters or death trigger when you do it. There is one other benefit to exiling something, and that is if your opponent kills a Siegebreaker, you do get something back. If you can rebuy into the battlefield or death triggers, it does get more interesting, but don't count on always pulling it off, giving it a B. Next up, it's Marshal of the Lost, which for 2 generic, a white and a black, is a 3/3 Orc Warrior at uncommon. It's got Death Touch. Whenever you attack, target creature gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of attacking creatures. I do like that this is an attack trigger, not a when this creature attacks trigger. So the turn this comes down, you can give +1/+1 to something at a minimum, provided you have an attack. That said, I've already said in this video, I don't like Hill Giant stat lines. They really don't pan out most of the time. Even when you add Death Touch to the mix, sure, it can trade for anything, thanks to the keyword, but it isn't like that's a huge deal when you spent 4 mana on this. It does mean that you can give it a big buff, and double blocking it without getting 2-for-1 is pretty hard because of Death Touch, but I think this is just a C+. Next, it's Monastery Messenger, another hybrid mana card, so it costs a blue, a red, and a white, but you can pay 2 generic for any of those instead. It has Flying and Vigilance, and when it enters, you put up to 1 target non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard on top of your library, and it's a 2/3. So this enters trigger is fine, but very easy to overrate. It's not markedly different than like Scry or Surveil 1 in that it just gives you some card selection. Sure, you can make sure you redraw a spell and maybe set up some flurry, but you also won't always have something you really want to spend your next turn drawing. The stats on this are solid, but paying 4 for this sounds kind of miserable. So when you have to do that, you're not going to feel great about it. And when you spend 3 on it, you're also not going to feel like you're getting an amazing deal. You're just getting an okay one. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Narset Jeskai Waymaster, which for a blue, a red, and a white is a 3/4 legendary human monk at rare. At the beginning of your end step, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw cards equal to the number of spells you've cast this turn. So if this was a 3-mana 3/4 that let you loot at your end step every turn, it'd be nuts, but it's not quite that or really even that close. There will be lots of turns where you can sort of loot with this, and sometimes you'll loot more than once. This also increases your chances of casting spells on future turns, and there will be times where your hand is empty and this just really lets you reload. Still, you also don't always want to discard your entire hand, and you're not always going to be able to set this up. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Narrative, Heart of the Storm, which for one generic, a red, a white, and a black, is a 4/5 legendary spirit dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and if a creature you control that entered this turn would deal damage, it deals twice that much damage instead. This effect isn't that amazing. It only doubles the damage dealt by creatures that have entered that turn, so unless a creature has haste and or an enters trigger, it isn't going to matter. Now, the idea here is that it turns your mobilized tokens into 2/1s effectively, and that's certainly an upgrade. And you should also be a little more into haste than usual when you have Narrative, and there is plenty of haste in Mardu, but not so much that you're going to have more than a few cards with it. So frequently this ability won't have a massive impact on the game. But you are getting an efficient flyer with an ability that will make a few of your cards better, and it's hard to be upset about that, giving it a B. Next up, it's New Way Forward, which for 2 generic, a blue, a red, and a white is a rare instant. The next time a source of your choice would deal damage to you this turn, prevent that damage. When damage is prevented this way, New Way Forward deals that much damage to that source's controller, and you draw that many cards. This has like a really high ceiling, but it also seems way too reactive and conditional for limited. There just aren't always turns where this can do something. And I mean, letting a 2/2 through and paying 5 to do 2 to them and draw 2 isn't exactly a good deal. The ceiling is high to be sure, but I think it's a D since there are way too many awkward situations with it. Next up, it's Perilous, which for 3 generic, a white, a black, and a green is a mythic rare sorcery. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a hexproof counter and an indestructible counter on it. It's tough to make reanimation work well in limited because you often can't get something back that's worth the mana, and this costs 6. However, Perilous does some stuff to make sure you don't feel that way most of the time, as a hexproof and indestructible counter makes whatever you reanimate into at least a relevant body on the board, and sometimes makes it into an absolute monster. I mean, even if you have to reanimate a 2/2 with it, it's not a disaster, though, that's not good either. That said, as long as you do reanimate something that is decent or better, this is going to feel really good, and sometimes, like I said, it'll just be insane. It does take some setup, but by the time you cast this, it's not hard to imagine you having something worth getting back. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Purging Stormbrood, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon creature dragon. It's a 4/4 with flying and ward, pay 2 life. And when it enters, remove all counters from up to 1 target creature. It's also got an omen called Absorb Essence, which for 1 generic and a white is an instant. And it says target creature gets +2/+2 and gains lifelink and hexproof until end of turn. So you're going to use the combat trick mode on this in the early game and feel pretty good about it. It's the kind of combat trick that saves your creature from removal and also helps it win most combat while gaining you some life. So when a situation presents itself where you can use Absorb Essence effectively, you will. And if that situation doesn't present itself, and sometimes it doesn't, you can just hold on to it and then play it as the Stormbrood. The Stormbrood isn't an insane card by any stretch, but it certainly has a relevant body. The ward means it's hard for your opponent not to get hurt by it at least a little bit before they kill it, and the enters trigger will be relevant sometimes. I mean, it's probably going to be irrelevant more often than it's relevant, to be fair, but there will be times where it significantly downgrades a creature or something like that. Basically, I think this is like 2 C-level cards stapled together, and getting modality out of 2 cards that you'd probably play anyway in a lot of your decks probably makes this a C+. Next up, it's Rakshasa's Bargain, another one of the hybrid cards, so it costs a black, a green, and a blue, or you can pay 2 generic for any of those, and it's an uncommon instant. It says look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. If you can pay 3 for this, it's a pretty sweet card draw, card selection spell, and it even loads the graveyard. It gets a lot worse if you're paying 4, but it isn't terrible if you spend that. You don't feel like you are way overpaying or anything. And I think casting it for 3 is reasonably likely in the format to begin with. This looks pretty good to me. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Rediscover the Way, which for a blue, a red, and a white is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 and 2 say look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Chapter 3 says whenever you cast a non-creature spell this turn, target creature you control gains double strike until end of turn. So this is ultimately 3 mana to draw 2 cards and probably give one thing double strike for a turn, although that last part isn't even guaranteed even with the card draw. The card selection for the first 2 chapters is nice, but not adding to the board really ever. It adds temporarily to the board with Chapter 3, definitely hurts this card. That said, it's also not a card you ever cut from a Jeskai deck because it does give you some very real value. And the double strike thing, if you can do it with an instant, is especially potent because your opponent will have no idea what you might be able to give double strike to, or whether you can give more than one thing double strike. So it's a pretty good card. It's just slow and doesn't really add to the board, and those things hurt Magic cards in this day and age. I think it's just a C+. Next up, it's Reigning Victor, another hybrid card. This one costs red, white, and a black, but you can pay 2 generic for any of those. And it's a common creature Orc Warrior. It's a 3/3 with Mobilize 1. And when it enters, target creature gets +1/+0 and gains Indestructible until end of turn. You know, this enters trigger always reads like it would be amazing, but we've seen so many versions of this effect just not be that good. You think of it as giving you like a free attack for a turn, and like it certainly can do that. And in this format, having a free attack is going to be a little more valuable, especially in Mardu, because your creature might have Mobilize, so attacking with it and getting those extra bodies might matter. But it's still an ability that ends up just not doing anything a decent chunk of the time. But we're talking about a 3-mana 3/3 with Mobilize 1, and an interest trigger that does matter sometimes. So it's not like it's a bad card, although it is kind of bad. You know, this is one where if you spend 4 total mana or more on it, it's going to feel kind of miserable. And if you're spending 3, you feel like you're getting the deal you deserve, giving it a C. Next up, it's Reputable Merchant, which is another hybrid card. This one costs white, black, and green, but you can pay 2 generic for any of those. And it's a 2/2 Human Citizen at common. When it enters or dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So this can put that first counter on itself if your board's empty, and if you have somewhere else to put it, that's usually even better. Getting 2 counters total out of this is pretty nice, especially if you're trading off. This is another one that feels pretty bad though if you spend 4 mana or more on it, but I do think it feels pretty good when you're spending 3. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Revival of the Ancestors, which for 1 generic, a white, a black, and a green, is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 makes 3 1/1 white spirit creature tokens. Chapter 2 distributes 3 +1/+1 counters among 1, 2, or 3 target creatures you control. And Chapter 3 gives creatures you control trample and lifelink until end of turn. So this is a really good saga. Those 3 bodies up front is amazing. That's a substantial addition to your board, and Chapter 2 adds to your board too. Even if you had nothing else, chances are good you can buff the tokens you made, and usually you're going to have something else. And then Chapter 3 makes a lot of boards way better for a turn because, you know, you're going to be much more willing to attack with everything when you're also gaining life. Plus, trample being in the mix means chump blocking is not really an option. So, you know, this is going to do a lot. You do have to wait several turns before it does everything, as with all sagas, but the fact it gives you those bodies up front really makes up for that in most ways, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Riverwheel Sweep. This is one of the hybrid cards, so it costs a blue, a red, and a white, but you can pay 2 generic for any of those. It's an uncommon sorcery. It says tap target creature, put 3 stun counters on it. Exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. So, we've seen this effect a lot lately. Cards that stun a creature for several turns, and none of them have been good in limited. In fact, most of them have been one of the worst cards in that particular limited format. The main problem is, it's basically like a really bad removal spell because your opponent still has access to that card in a lot of ways. Not only do they get that card back at some point if the game goes long enough, they also still have access to static abilities. They can still sacrifice it for value, still have access to most activated abilities. So frequently, it's like you go down a card without getting a full card worth of value. This makes up for that some because of its effect that lets you, sort of draw a card the way red often draws cards, and it gives you some selection too. You can choose one of the top 2 cards. That might help you set up Flurry, but it also means that you get a card back from this right away to make up for the fact that the base effect on this card just hasn't proven to be powerful enough for a card. Still, I do think you really need to be spending like 3 mana on this for it to feel even solid, and if you're spending 4, I think you're going to feel like you're getting ripped off. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Roar of Endless Song, which for 2 generic, a green, a blue, and a red, is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 and 2 make 5/5 green elephant creature tokens, and Chapter 3 doubles the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. So you spend 5 mana for 2 5/5s. You'd have to wait for that second one, but getting one up front is big, and Chapter 3 is going to turn mini boards lethal, especially if your 2 elephants are still hanging out. This gives you an easy 2-for-1, and you can win the game with it too. I think it's a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Runescale Stormbrood, which for 3 generic into red is a 2/4 dragon at uncommon. It's got flying. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell or a dragon spell, this creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. And it has an omen. This one is Chilling Screech for 1 generic and a blue. It's an instant, and it counters target spell with mana value 2 or less. So the Omen side here is a super narrow counterspell, and one that you're only going to fire off if things line up for you to cast it. And even when you do, it's not going to feel like amazing, because the best you can do is break even on mana when you cast it most of the time. The other side is where you get more of the value in this case. I mean, a 4 mana 2/4 flyer is a solid enough rate to begin with, and when you attack with this, it's often going to have either the ability to become a 4/4 because you have an instant, or just be a 4/4 because you played another dragon. I think this is a case where you have like a D level card in Chilling Screech stapled to like a C in Runescale Stormbrood, but flexibility of the card, you know, the fact that it kind of fills your curve on 2 when it needs to, and can also be a 4-drop when it needs to be, is enough for this to be a C+. Next up, it's Severance Priest, which for a white, a black, and a green is a 3/3 Djinn Cleric at rare. It's got Death Touch. When it enters, target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, exile that card. When this creature leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates an XX white spirit creature token, where X is the mana value of the exiled card. This type of effect always plays really well. I mean, you add a real body to the board and take away your opponent's most useful card, often a removal spell. And sure, the priest may die eventually, but your opponent getting a creature token a few turns later, after having to use a card to take down the priest in the first place, either a removal spell or trading with it, and Death Touch means it'll trade with anything, it just ends up not being that big of a deal that your opponent gets a token at some point when you take something away that's way better. You're breaking even on cards, and you disrupted your opponent in a massive way, giving it a B. Next up, it's Shiko, Paragon of the Way, which for 2 generic, a blue, a red, and a white is a 4/5 legendary spirit dragon at mythic rare. It's got flying and vigilance, and when it enters, exile target non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard, copy it, then you may cast a copy without paying its mana cost. This has really great stats that allow it to be relevant during every combat thanks to vigilance, and most of the time you'll get to cast a spell for free from your graveyard. It's great that it's not particularly picky about the type of spell, so it'll be pretty hard for you not to have something to cast when you play this, and that will give you a 2-for-1 up front, and a creature that is a massive threat beyond that. Also, by its very nature, it'll just trigger everything you have with Flurry. This is a bomb, I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Skirmish Rhino, which for a white, a black, and a green is a 3/4 Rhino at uncommon. It's got Trample, and when it enters, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. That's right, they gave us a baby Siege Rhino, and it's pretty good. Draining life is nice as an enters trigger. It opens up a 4-point life difference right away, and then you get a creature that is relevant on most boards. Even with good mana, you won't always be able to drop this on 3, but still looks pretty good to me, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Songcrafter Mage, which for a green, a blue, and a red is a 3/2 Human Bard at rare. It's got Flash, and when it enters, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains Harmonize until end of turn. Its Harmonize cost is equal to its mana cost. So in most ways, Harmonize is just better than Flashback, since you have the capacity to reduce the cost of the spell, and if you have Songcrafter Mage in play, you have a ready-made way to do it, because, you know, you can tap the mage. So I see this feeling like Snapcaster Mage a huge chunk of the time, and that's pretty good company to keep. It means this can generate 2-for-1s pretty well, and you won't always have something to Harmonize, especially on like turn 3, but later in the game this will do some serious work. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Sonic Shrieker, which for 2 generic, a red, a white, and a black is a 4/4 dragon at uncommon with flying. When it enters, it deals 2 damage to any target and you gain 2 life. If a player is dealt damage this way, they discard a card. This is really good. It's a 5 mana 4/4 flyer that can kill an X2 and gain you 2 life. I'd play that all the time. Or a 5 mana 4/4 flyer that does 2 to your opponent, gains you 2 life, and makes them discard. I'd always play that card, and you have the option between both of them, and then you have this very real body that's just left behind that can certainly threaten your opponent and be relevant on mini board states. You know, Air Elemental isn't the most impressive stat line these days, but when you staple an enters trigger to it that will give you a card worth of value virtually every time you play it, we're talking about something entirely different. I think this is a B+. Next up, it's Stalwart Successor, which for 1 generic, a black, and a green is a 3/2 Human Warrior at uncommon. It has Menace, and whenever 1 or more counters are put on a creature you control, if it's the first time counters have been put on that creature this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. So a 3 mana 3/2 menace is fine. I don't love that there are 1 mana ways to destroy it at lower rarity, but still, augmenting token effects certainly matters in this format. It's nice that if you put a keyword counter on something, you still get a +1/+1 counter, but there will be a lot of times where this just feels French vanilla, especially when you run it out on 3 and it's just got a stat line that isn't really that great. I mean, it can't block 2 drops very well, or even some of the 1 drops in the format that have 2 power. So this doesn't feel like it pulls you into black-green in a big way, but you're always going to play it in the color pair. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Temur Battlecrier, which for a green, a blue, and a red is a 4/3 Orc Ranger at rare, and during your turn, spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. So, on its own, this decreases the cost of spells by 1 generic, which is pretty nice, especially if you can just play it on curve on turn 3. It's worth remembering, though, that this type of effect often has diminishing returns as the game goes on. But like, if you draw this later in the game, it's just a vanilla 3 mana 4/3 in virtually any way that matters. But the good news is a 3 mana 4/3 vanilla is a fine card to draw. I mean, it's not amazing, but it's a body and one that's reasonably efficient and one that has high power, and you're in a Temur deck, so that probably matters. So I think it's a B overall. Next up, it's Temur Tawnyback, another one of the hybrid cards, so you can pay a green, a blue, and a red for it, but you can also pay 2 generic for any of those. It's a 4/3 beast at common, and when it enters, you draw a card and then discard a card. So if you spend 4 on this, I think you still feel pretty alright about it. I mean, it gives you some good card selection, gives you a 4 mana 4/3. That card would probably be close to a C level card, and when you spend 3 on this, it's going to feel especially good. It can help you load your graveyard with Harmonize, in addition to just, you can throw a land away to draw a spell and things like that, which is always a really nice effect to have. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Teyval, Arbiter of Virtue, which for 2 generic, a black, a green, and a blue, is a 6/6 legendary spirit dragon at Mythic Rare. It has flying and lifelink. Spells you cast have Delve, which means each card you exile from your graveyard while casting those spells pays for 1 generic. And whenever you cast a spell, you lose life, equal to its mana value. Delve is really strong, and this is a big flying lifelinker, and that lifelink fact really matters since once Teyval is in play, you start losing life for casting spells. Any spells. Keep in mind it's not just the ones you delve. Sometimes that's going to be a big hurdle, but I think this will allow you to cast spells from your graveyard and gain you enough life for it to really turn a game in your favor most of the time. There will be times where it kills you, of course. It's kind of like Speed Demon in the last set, where it had the capacity to win you the game really quickly, but if you got it in the wrong situation, you might also just die, but more often than not, it's going to win you the game. So overall, I think it's a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Thunder of Unity, which for a red, a white, and a black is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 draws you 2 cards and you lose 2 life, and Chapter 2 and 3 say whenever a creature you control enters this turn, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So 3 mana to draw 2 and lose 2 at sorcery speed is an okay magic card. That does mean this doesn't add to the board up front, and in fact, it can open up a window where you've lost some life and haven't added to the board where you're in a ton of danger. But I do think it makes up for putting you behind on board and life by draining some life on the next couple of turns, and presumably the cards you draw will help you pull that off. Obviously, Mobilize works nicely with the Chapter 2 and 3 effect too. Cards that have Mobilize 2 and 3 are just going to become pretty insane. But there are times where you can't really do anything with this since it effectively does nothing to add to the board all on its own. Like, it needs you to be doing something with the board, and that does dampen how excited I am about this card. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Twin Maw Stormbrood, which for 5 generic and a white is a 5/4 dragon at uncommon with flying, and when it enters you gain 5 life, but it has an omen called Charring Bite, which for 1 generic and a red is a sorcery, and it deals 5 damage to target creature without flying. So Charring Bite on its own is like a B. That's a great removal spell that virtually always trades up, and sure, you can't take down dragons with it, but there's plenty of creatures it can kill for very little mana. Twin Maw Stormbrood on its own would probably be like a C. The stats aren't great, but it adds a real body to the board and gains you a hefty chunk of life, which really can help you stabilize in lots of games of Limited. I think having one card that can do both of these is a B+. This is like a premium removal spell with massive upside. Next up, it's Ureni, the Song Unending, which for 5 generic, a green, a blue, and a red is a 10/10 legendary spirit dragon at Mythic Rare. It has flying and protection from white and black, and when it enters, it deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers your opponents control, where X is the number of lands you control. So, yeah, 8 mana is a lot, but this gives you exactly what you deserve for the cost. It'll probably just win you the game. It comes down, can wipe out everything relevant your opponent has, and you're left with a 10/10 that is entirely immune to a bunch of removal and very hard to block. This is a legit win condition, and one that makes it well worth ramping into, and Teamer does have the capacity to do that. It does cost 8 though, and I have to temper my expectations a little bit because of that. Like, there are going to be lots of games where this is stuck in your hand and you can never play it because it costs so much. If you cast it, you probably win. If you don't, it's kind of like you mulligan. But I think the upside here is enough, and there's enough ramping in the set for this to be a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. And if the format is slower and getting to 8 is even easier, this might just be the biggest bomb in the set. Next up, it's Whirlwing Stormbrood, which for 4 generic and a green is an uncommon dragon. It's a 4/3 with flash and flying, and you can cast sorceries and dragons as though they had flash. It has an omen called Dynamic Soar, which for 2 generic and a green is a sorcery. Put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. So you'll have turns where casting this as a sorcery really lets you do something impressive, like when your opponent is tapped out and you have a creature that they just can't block effectively after the buff. And a 5 mana 4/3 flyer with flash that can give flash to other stuff is a solid card too. Sometimes it can ambush block something smaller, and sometimes it can set up your other dragons to do the same thing. It is worth noting that overall, the ability where like now you can play things at instant speed kind of underwhelms in limited overall. Like, you just have to end up with the right kinds of cards for that to matter anyway, and you just don't always do it. But this card does a couple of different things that are both pretty solid. I think it looks like a nice card overall. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Windcrag Siege, which for 1 generic, a red and a white is a rare enchantment. When it enters, you choose Mardu or Jeskai. If you choose Mardu, if a creature attacking causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And if you choose Jeskai, at the beginning of your upkeep, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. It gains lifelink and haste until end of turn. So this looks pretty good. The Jeskai mode has the highest floor and has a pretty darn high ceiling too, as getting a 1/1 token every turn is a pretty big deal, and if you can attack, it'll even gain you some life. And if you have a board with a whole bunch of mobilize and other attack triggers, you can choose Mardu to break the game wide open. Basically, Jeskai's good when you don't have the board built out already, and Mardu often can be. But this is another one where I think you choose the mode that doesn't ask for as much setup in the form of Jeskai more often than not. This is a card, though, that won't start adding to the board until your next turn, because the Jeskai triggers on the beginning of your next upkeep. So if you don't already have a bunch of mobilize, it's not going to make a huge difference right away, and that's a little scary, but I still think it's really good, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Yathen Road Watcher, which for 1 generic, a white, a black, and a green is a 3/3 human scout at rare. When it enters, if you cast it, mill 4 cards. When you do, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. I think you'll reanimate something with this reasonably often. I mean, if it's in your opening hand, you can even trade off aggressively and plan on getting something back. Plus, it does some milling to help set itself up, making it even more likely you get something. And when you do, this is going to deliver great value. I just don't see that many situations where you don't get a 2-for-1 here. I'm giving it an A-. And our last multicolored card is Zurgo Thunder's Decree, which for a red, a white, and a black is a 2/4 legendary orc warrior at rare. It's got mobilize too, and during your instep, warrior tokens you control have this token can't be sacrificed. So this is pretty sweet. Even if Zurgo didn't prevent the mobilize tokens from being sacrificed, a 3 mana 2/4 with mobilize 2 would be a pretty good card. But that ability means that none of your 1/1s that are mobilized will go away. I also love that they were careful to make it so that only comes up during your instep, so you can still sack those tokens for value whenever you want. And I also like that the way the tokens work, even if Zurgo dies eventually, those 1/1s that are generated by mobilize on a turn where Zurgo's still around during your instep are going to stick around forever. I'm giving him a B+. Zurgo was our last multicolored card, but before we get to the colorless ones, I want to remind you to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this video. I'm closing in on 100,000 subscribers and would love to hit that number later this year, and I'd really love your help. I put out lots of Magic content, including the rest of this set review, so you won't regret it. Alright, our first colorless card is Ugin, Eye of the Storms, which for 7 generic mana is a mythic rare legendary planeswalker Ugin. Starts with 7 loyalty. When you cast it, you exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. He's got a +2 that says you gain 3 life and draw a card, a 0 that gives you 3 colorless mana, and a -11 that says search your library for any number of colorless non-land cards, exile them, then shuffle. Until end of turn, you may cast those cards without paying their mana costs. 7 mana is a lot, but at a minimum, Ugin is going to exile pretty much any non-land permanent, draw you a card, and gain you 3 life. Then he has the potential to do way more than that because his loyalty is massive, and his removal effect will have made it easier to keep him around too. Exiling more permanents with him can be a little tough, but it's not impossible. You know, we're about to see several colorless cards in this set, and there are some solid ones, and you're certainly going to be incentivized to play some more of them if you have this powerful Planeswalker. He's pretty close to like a 3-for-1 up front and gets more ridiculous from there, so he's definitely a bomb. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Abzan Monument, which for 2 generic is an uncommon artifact. When it enters, search your library for a basic Planeswamp or Forest card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And you can pay 1 generic, a white, a black, and a green, and tap it and sacrifice it to create an XX white spirit creature token, where X is the greatest toughness among creatures you control, activate only as a sorcery. So there's a whole cycle of these, and they all look pretty nice. Fixing your mana in the early game with this is great, and getting a body out of it later is pretty awesome, especially because the ceiling on that body in this case can be pretty high. I mean, it does mean that you don't get anything if you don't have a creature, but setting this up to make like a 4/4 isn't a big ask, and that's a 2-for-1 when you get to search up a land early and then make a very real body. And I think that makes up for the fact that this doesn't add to the board at all the turn it comes down. So I think it looks like a C+. Next up, it's Boulderborn Dragon, which for 5 generic mana is a 3/3 artifact creature dragon. At common, it's got flying and vigilance, and when it attacks, you surveil 1. This doesn't look great. It gives you a common dragon for all the Behold stuff, I guess, and it works in any deck. And if you have Ugin, well, you probably do play it in your Ugin deck, but it's still pretty understated and underwhelming on most boards and in most decks. It's probably a D+. Next up, it's Dragonfire Blade, which for 1 generic is a rare artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has hexproof from Monocolored. It equips for 4 generic, but it costs 1 generic less to equip for each color of the creature that it targets. Even equipping this for 4 doesn't sound horrendous, and it'll virtually always equip for 3 or less as long as you're equipping it to something that's at least 1 color. And sometimes it'll be a lot less. There are plenty of 3-colored creatures in this format. The buff is a big deal, although less of a big deal in this format than in most, since everyone will probably have at least 1 removal spell that can still target whatever you put this on. But still, it makes just about any creature into a threat and makes it very difficult to kill, and reasonably efficiently too. I think it's a B. Next up, it's Dragonstorm Globe, which for 3 generic is a common artifact. Each dragon you control enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. It's not often that a 3-mana mana rock that can tap for 1 mana of any color is good and limited. You just usually can't afford not to add to the board once you're spending 3 mana. That said, it does look like some decks, especially in Teamer, are going to be interested in doing some ramping, and you're reasonably likely to get a counter or 2 out of this. So this may not be the D that it would be in most formats, but I'm still pretty skeptical and not willing to go above a D+. Next up, it's Embermouth Sentinel, which for 2 generic is a 2/1 artifact creature chimera at common. When it enters, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, then shuffle and put that card on top. If you control a dragon, put that card onto the battlefield tapped instead. So we see 2-mana 2/1 artifact creature that puts a land on top all the time, and it's always like a D or a D-. It's not an efficient creature, and it fixes your mana very poorly. It can do the job when you need it, but you hope you don't need it. But the dragon upside here is pretty legit. It turns into straight up ramp and an actual 2-for-1 when you have a dragon. It's a little sad that they didn't make it have Behold, but that would probably be nuts. Like if you could play this on 2, reveal a dragon in your hand and ramp to 3 mana, like Rampant Growth, Colorless, add a body to the board, that's an insane card. So that's why this doesn't have Behold. So typically it's only going to be able to grab you a land when you've already got a decent chunk of mana, but it's still going to feel pretty good to grab a land when that's the case. So I think this does enough to be a C, much better than most versions of this card we've seen. Next up, it's Jadecast Sentinel, which for 4 generic is a 1/5 artifact creature ape snake at common. It's got reach, and for 2 generic and tapping it, you can put target card from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. It's pretty rare that the defensive artifact creature that lets you put cards from a graveyard on the bottom of your library is worth it and limited. I mean, sure, you can use it to disrupt an opposing graveyard or to keep yourself from milling out, and you can even choose what to draw every turn when your library's empty. That's sort of the pipe dream. But those things are irrelevant almost always, and the ability is expensive. So you rarely find time to actually use this, even when it is useful, and a 4 mana 1/5 with reach just isn't good. So I think this is just a D-. Next up, it's the Jeskai Monument. It's 2 generic mana for an uncommon artifact. Lets you search up a basic land that makes mana of one of the Jeskai colors. And you can pay 1 generic, a blue, a red, and a white, and tap it and sacrifice it to make 2 1/1 white bird creature tokens with flying. Activate only as a sorcery. So, like the other monument, great at fixing your mana, then gives you a real presence on the board a little bit later in the game. Flying creatures are often worth more than, like a 1/1 flyer is often worth more than like a 2/2 token, although that may be less true in a format where there are dragons everywhere. But still, this is going to generate what feels like a 2-for-1 most of the time, and I think it's worth it and great for your mana in a format where mana really matters, giving it a C+. Next is the Mardu Monument, which is 2 generic for an uncommon artifact. You already know what it's going to search up for you, and its activated ability is 2 generic, a red, a white, and a black, and tap it and sacrifice it to make 3 1/1 red warrior creature tokens. They gain menace and haste until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. Once again, this is good at fixing, and the bodies it gives you late are nice. Even if you don't take advantage of the keywords, getting 3 1/1 tokens out of an artifact that drew you a card earlier in the game is still going to feel pretty good, and they're okay defensively too. And if you're ahead, they're really going to augment combat in a big way for you. It is true that Mardu looks to be more aggressive, and maybe it's less interested in dropping a 2 generic mana thing, so this one may be a little bit worse than the other ones, but I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Mox Jasper, which for 0 generic is a mythic rare legendary artifact. Add 1 mana of any color, activate only if you control a dragon. Yeah, going down a card for super conditional mana rock, even a free one, isn't worth it in limited. This will often do nothing, and by the time it does something, you probably don't really need the mana. It's an F. Next up, it's Sultai Monument, which for 2 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. You know which lands it searches up, and you can pay 2 generic, a black, a green, and a blue, and tap it and sacrifice it to make 2 2/2 black zombie druid creature tokens. Activate only as a sorcery. Same thing as the others, draws you a card early, then generates a couple of bodies later that are certainly worth the card themselves. Sultai is probably going to be one of the grindier decks in the format too, so just like the Mardu one might be a little bit worse, this one's probably a little bit better, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Temur Monument, 2 generic, uncommon artifact. You know what it searches up. You can pay 3 generic, a green, a blue, and a red, and sacrifice it to make a 5/5 elephant token. Activate only as a sorcery. Has all the same great stuff going on as the others. It's another C+. Next up, it's Watcher of the Wayside, which for 3 generic is a 3/2 golem at common. When it enters, target player mills 2 cards and you gain 2 life. So the stat line here is bad, and the enters trigger is pretty medium. Generally, you're going to want to mill yourself with it, because if you're playing this, you're probably in a graveyard deck, and milling your opponent can be dangerous in a format with 2 graveyard mechanics. The life it gains you is okay, but overall, this just doesn't really feel like it does enough for 3 mana. It's probably a D+. All right, let's move to the lands now, starting with Quarry Mountain Monastery. It's a rare land that enters tapped unless you control a plains or an island, can tap for red, and you can pay 3 generic and a red and exile the top card of your library, and until the end of your next turn, you can play that card. So there's a cycle of these, and most of them are pretty good in limited, and I think this one is one of the ones that is pretty good in limited. It can effectively draw you cards in the late game, and having a land that can start drawing you cards late is just a big deal. Like, you can play this early. There's a good chance it enters untapped if you're in Jeskai, so the downside isn't even that relevant if you're actually in Jeskai. And so it becomes a mountain with like massive upside where it starts drawing you cards later in the game. It's repeatable too. It doesn't sacrifice itself or anything like we see on land sometimes. So you can just end up doing this whenever you are flooding out. If you whiff on your draw, you get another crack at it, and that's a good way to win longer games, giving it a B. Next up, it's Dalkovan Encampment, which is the rare land in the same cycle. It enters tapped unless you control a swamp or a mountain. It can tap to add white. And you can pay 2 generic and white and tap it to, whenever you attack this turn, create 2 1/1 red warrior creature tokens that are tapped and attacking, sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. So this basically lets you pay 3 mana for Mobilize 2, and that can certainly alter combat in a big way and give you some nice sacrifice fodder. There are lots of ways to take advantage of those tokens. So this is another utility land that can really alter the game in your favor later, while just doing exactly what you need a land to do in the early game, giving it a B-. We also have the gain land cycle in this set. These all produce 2 colors of mana, enter tapped, and when they enter, you gain 1 life. Dismal Backwater, for example, taps for blue or black. So fixing is more important in this format than in most. You're almost always going to be playing 3 colors. You'll primarily be in 1 color pair, but you're going to end up splashing like 3 or 4 cards that have a 3rd color. These are one of the lands that really helps you do it, and they're always good fixing anyway. Even in formats where fixing isn't as important, having a land that can produce 2 different colors is really powerful. Mana bases and limited are just awful, and you end up in lots of situations where you don't have double black or you don't have double blue, and adding Dismal Backwaters to your deck really shores up your mana base in a pretty big way, and the life it gains you even helps make up a little bit for it entering tapped, giving this a C+. We've also got Evolving Wilds, another nice source of fixing we see all the time. Common land, you can tap it and sack it to search your library for a basic land, put on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So, like the gain lands, this gives you good fixing in a format where it really matters. And going to the graveyard has a tiny bit of upside in this set too, so it's a C+. We've also got the Tri-lands, one for each of the 5 clans. Frontier Bivouac is the Teamer one. They all enter tapped and can add mana of one of the 3 colors of that particular clan. So I'm going to value these really highly to start the format because every other time we've had a 3-color set, taking the Tri-land has been really powerful because, like I've already said, you end up really in 3 colors on a regular basis, and the more Tri-lands you can pick up, the harder you can go into those 3-color cards, most of which, as we've seen in this video, are pretty darn powerful. So I'm going to take these pretty highly to start the format. I think they're like a B-. Next up, it's Great Erishan City, which is a rare land. It enters tapped unless you control a forest or a plains. You can tap for black, and you can pay 1 generic and exile a creature card from your graveyard to make a 1/1 white spirit creature token. You won't always have stuff in your graveyard, but by the part of the game when you're wanting to use the activated abilities that your lands have, you probably have some expendable bodies in there that you'd love to just turn into 1/1s. There's also a few cards in the format, as we've already seen in this video, that pay you off for having cards leave your graveyard, and this can help you do that while also making a solid little body. Turning them out at instant speed is nice too. This is a land that's a pretty real value engine. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Kishla Village, which is a rare land. It enters tapped unless you control an island or a swamp. You can tap it for green, and you can pay 3 generic and a green and tap it to surveil 2. I don't think Surveil is quite as good as straight up drawing cards or mobilizing or turning creatures in your graveyard into tokens, but it is nice value to have on a land in the late game. You can improve your draws and even load the graveyard. I'm giving this one a C+. Next up, it's Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon, which is a rare land that taps for colorless. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana only to cast a dragon spell or an omen spell, and you can pay 4 generic and tap it and sacrifice it to search your library for a dragon, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. Even in a set with lots of dragons, this is mostly going to produce colorless mana and be bad for your mana base. It is nice that you can cash it in to tutor up a dragon later in the game, but this still doesn't look like a land you always want to play. Even in a set with this many dragons, you're going to have like 3 in most of your decks, and that's not really enough to justify playing a card like this. And being able to tutor up a dragon, not that exciting either. It certainly gets better when you have some of the big, bombiest dragons like the spirit dragons for each of the clans. But overall, I think this is a D+ that you usually don't play. And our last card in this very long video, because there were so many multicolored cards in this set, we've got Mistrise Village, which is a rare land. Enters tapped unless you control a mountain or forest, taps for blue, and you can pay 1 blue and tap it, and the next spell you cast this turn can't be countered. This one really pales in comparison to the other 4 in Limited, which is kind of funny, because in 60-card formats, this one's probably going to be the most relevant, but making stuff uncounterable in Limited isn't a big deal. Sure, there are some counter spells, but you end up going entire drafts where you play like 10 rounds without seeing a single counter spell sometimes, and I'd say the average is like, what? 2? You see like 2 counter spells, and you need to have Mistrise Village at the exact right time, or it doesn't do anything. So it ends up being, the others are all sort of like basic lands with upside. This one is basically an island with downside because the effect on it is so negligible. It's not entirely useless, but it's pretty close. I'm giving it a D+. So those are all the multicolored and colorless cards in Tarkir Dragonstorm. In the next video, I'll be looking at all the white ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you see the rest of the set review, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're watching this after more of the set review is out, you'll see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.
Mm-hmm.